Okay, good evening, everybody. We're happy to have Dr. Ray Pierotti from the University of Kansas with us. And Dr. Pierotti works in evolutionary biology with respect to his work and does a lot with respect to evolutionary ecology as well. And he's also involved in a indigenous nations graduate program, and he has Native American background and can give a unique perspective of sustainability in terms of understanding Native American perspectives as it relates to sustainability. So, Dr. Pierotti, we're going to let you go ahead and share with us. And
so you want me to clip this on me?
Put that on you somewhere. So.
I won't wander around.
Yeah.
Can you? Am I perfectly audible? Okay. What happened? Okay. Like Larry said, I'm Ray Pierotti, and one of the things that I have sort of a unique appointment, as far as I can tell, in academia in the U.S. and probably internationally as well, in that I have an appointment that's 50% in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and 50% in the Global Indigenous Nation Studies program at the University of Kansas. And the reason I do this is because I have been really interested for most of my life in looking at science, or what is considered science, from an indigenous perspective as well as from the traditional Western perspective. And since Larry's asked me to talk about sustainable issues tonight, what I want to do is sort of start off, the examples I use are mostly going to be from the people who lived on the prairies. The Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Dakota, the few Assiniboine. There's a few others in there, but those are the places with which I'm most familiar, the cultural traditions, and so I'm going to emphasize those in what I cover. Okay, well, one thing right off we start off when we look at sustainability, that you guys, I mean, you've all heard this many times, that when you're talking about things from the Western perspective, sustainability is usually defined as meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Well, indigenous people have had a similar sort of concept that's a lot older, but they never described it in terms of sensibility. In the Native American tradition, the assumption is that you need to consider the impact of any actions you take on 7 generations. And some people say this means 3 generations back, 3 generations forward, but most people consider this as looking at your descendants for 7 generations and making sure the world you leave your descendants is in good enough shape that you assume that it can easily last 7 more generations. Now, one thing where this very quickly runs into sort of a conflict in the way we normally think about sustainability is trying to understand the role of economics in all this. Because, most of the stuff, and I don't know all the topics you guys have talked about in here, but generally in what are called developed countries, there's an attempt in sustainability to try to integrate economic growth and social development with environmental protection. And what this does is end up creating a constant struggle about actual costs. I mean, one real clear-cut example of this that can be seen in the present political, social, environmental situation we're describing here is the way we've used and harvested or mined oil or petroleum for things. It's very clear, since the petroleum culture in North America and basically the world is not just about 150 years old. The first oil wells in Pennsylvania, commercial oil well in Pennsylvania, was drilled in 1859. And we're in 2008. That's not quite 150 years later, and we're already worried that we're running out. So very clear, I mean, really what you're talking about with 150 years is 7 generations. So it's very clear that the people who first started developing and exploiting oil did not consider future generations as much as they probably should have, and especially since in the United States we hit peak oil in 1972. How many of you, other than Larry and I, were alive in 1972? Your ancestors were not thinking. We apologize because we weren't thinking properly about you guys. But indigenous traditions assume a different type of economy than the Western tradition. And so when you're talking about costs in an indigenous tradition, what you're assuming is what will be the impact on future generations, not what will be the dollars and cents of cleaning up a mess you've made. Normally, say, like in the oil industry, that one of the costs they factor in is, oh, well, you know, if we drill for oil and we have a spill, how much will it cost us to clean it up? They never even thought about things like global warming, which is why when people started suggesting that global warming was starting to occur in the late 1970s and early 1980s, everybody said, oh, it can't be. And you still have a lot of people denying it's happening, especially governors from states that depend very heavily on the petroleum industry for their state's economy. So what you're seeing is that in an indigenous tradition, there's a tendency to consider all needs or all the components of the community, and this includes the non-humans. So when you're looking at sustainability, you need to think of your impact not just on the human populations, but also upon the non-humans, and even upon geographical features, which turns out to be a really important thing. There's been a tendency during much of my lifetime, and I'm sure Larry can sort of support this in some ways, to treat rivers as if they were convenient dumping grounds. Same thing with oceans. And then to discover later on, oh my God, this actually has an economic or social impact or health impacts. Well, again, one of the things, if you consider a river to be a being or an entity that has its own reasons for existence, you tend not to just make a mess of it because you can and because it's cheap. And the same thing is true of oceans or lakes or whatever type of system you're looking at. And one of the things that's important here is that's often not talked about is economics is very, very important to consider at a local level, but because economics is really like ecology and physics and many other things, it's a mathematically driven science, really. It seeks universal solutions which may not really exist in a meaningful sense. So you hear about sort of macroeconomics and the global scale economic issues. A lot of those models have failed badly, which is why some of the events of the last couple of weeks or months have taken place. And this is because people don't think of economics as being something that's important primarily at the local level. This is where you hear the debates about Wall Street versus Main Street. Wall Street is sort of the giant overseer of the whole thing. Main Street is supposedly the local level at which people are being impacted. But really what's happening is, like I said, is people are not considering things at a local level. And so, what happened? Shouldn't have gone that way. There. So what happens is you end up with, or especially if you look at the history of things, you have some very, very different worldviews that are involved when you're debating or discussing indigenous versus Western philosophical traditions. And I'm borrowing fairly heavily from the fine Lakota scholar and philosopher Vine Deloria on this, who wrote mostly about religion and law, but he made the point, which I think is a key one, which is that the Western philosophical tradition tends to be temporally oriented. You see your current place in history, and you look back or forward, especially backwards, to sort of figure out where things are going. And you can see this in sort of the spiritual traditions. Most of the spiritual traditions in the Western world are more than 1,000 years old, and the laws that were developed for those spiritual traditions at the time were probably very sensible 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000 years ago. Today, maybe not so much. So you see dietary restrictions and statements about the way to treat the land and things in some of these traditions that are not really applicable in today's world, even though they may well have been when they were first expounded upon and developed by people thousands of years ago. And one thing, the consequence of this is you tend to view history as being linear. That is, history always moves in a straight line, which means that you're assuming that it's progressive, that things keep getting better and better. Well, we're about to hit a real irony, and I actually, I want to sort of apologize in a general sense for my generation and my parents' generation when I'm looking at things like this, because you guys may be the first generation to face a world that is clearly not better than the one your parents or grandparents lived in. And I'm talking about economic, social, any way you care to think about it, because we're running out of key resources. The salaries, people keep talking about the death of capitalism now as a result of these major economic shifts in the U.S. right now. But the assumption that these are sort of a result of the things that economics and society and social development and ideas and all should be progressive. And this really emerged during the Renaissance and was sort of followed up on by the Enlightenment, and it sort of moved into today's world. So you see, supposedly everything new is better than what went before. Whereas in contrast, in indigenous philosophical traditions, like the one I'm illustrating here, even though it doesn't really make exactly the same point, you're looking at indigenous people tend to be spatially oriented. They tend to see things as cyclical. And they see their current place in history in relation to the physical landscape they inhabit. So that you look at a mountain and you say, that is the mountain upon which the elders of my tribe first settled, many, many generations ago. Or that tree over there is the one in which underneath an important battle was fought 10 generations ago. So that you actually see the physical place. Whereas most of us are so displaced from the areas where we grew up, and even if we're not displaced from the areas where we grew up, we don't know the place where our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. grew up, that we lose a lot of this sense of place. And so history is defined by place. Everything really is defined by place in indigenous philosophy, and this changes things because one major consequence of it is history is nonlinear and there is no necessary progress. You can maintain the status quo, which is in essence the core of what sustainability is supposed to be about, for a very long time without actually making progress. Because progress often seems very good, but it can have consequences, as we're starting to realize. Okay, now what makes up a worldview? I'm borrowing again from one of my great colleagues here. And it's interesting that there are very few Native American scientists, but there are a lot of very good Native American educators. And Oscar Kawagli is a professor of education at the University of Alaska, and he's also a member of the Yupik people. And he wrote a book about the Yupik worldview that was essentially an attempt to create a way of looking at science that could be understood by traditional Yupik people that also incorporated ideas from Western science and sort of merged those in many ways with the traditions from his people. And he said that there are really 5 major questions we need to ask ourselves in terms of a worldview. The first is, what's real? I mean, that sounds kind of cliched and simplistic, but in fact, that's the basis of metaphysics. A lot of the debates we have in contemporary society really have their roots in what is real or not, including the idea of, is there a God? Is there a man who lives in the sky that you can pray to, or had you better take care of things yourself in the place where you live? Okay, that then is connected very strongly to what can we understand? Are there things actually out in the natural world that are beyond our ability to understand them? How is a thunderstorm formed? We have all sorts of models, but do you really know how a thunderstorm is formed? Or what causes an earthquake? Or there's all sorts of phenomena in this world. How does a fertilized zygote develop into a living adult individual of any species you choose? I mean, we sort of have a vague idea of how that happens, but we can't tell you the details. So there's lots of things that we really don't understand. The major difference is the Western world keeps hammering away trying to understand in greater and greater detail. In contrast, the indigenous perspective often says there are certain things we're just not meant to understand. Don't worry about them. Okay, then that leads to how should we behave? What are the ethical considerations we need to consider and deal with? And this, again, ties back to some of the stuff I was just talking about. Do you owe ethics to the Kansas River? Do you have a sense of responsibility in dealing with the Kansas River? I mean, you guys live on it. Lawrence is located on it. Manhattan's located on it. Topeka's located on it. Do the people who live in that community and in many cases, draw their drinking water and bathing water and cooking water from that river feel a sense of responsibility to that river as an entity, or do you feel your ethics are only involved with other human beings? And this changes the way you look at sustainability issues. And then there are a couple of other things that are, although people argue about them all the time, are actually relatively minor in some ways, except that they're real important in the way we think about things. One is what's pleasing to the senses. That's aesthetics. What is attractive to you? This can be mundane as, what movie star is hot, to how much am I willing to put up with in terms of gunk and disgusting stuff in my environment and my drinking water, which is fairly profound in terms of survival. And then, tying all those together, then we say, okay, what are the overall patterns upon which we can rely, which is the logical basis of our worldview or philosophy? And you really need to think about all of these in terms of and how they differ, because really all of these differ between Western indigenous and indigenous traditions for some of the reasons that I laid out to you about local versus global solutions and all. Okay, so the consequences of a worldview. In the indigenous perspective, which is what I'm going to concentrate on more now, sustainability has to be considered both over multiple generations and across all life forms. And by all life forms here, I mean, again, this is local. Those that live with you. Those that are part of your actual community. It's well and good to be concerned about the fate of African elephants or penguins in the Antarctic or the Amazonian rainforest. But in fact, how many of you think about the raccoons and deer and insects and plants and all that surround you? And this is a thing I'm always challenging my students at KU about, because many of them are much more concerned with the Amazonian rainforest than they are with the destruction of ecological communities, in their own neighborhood. And so as a consequence, again, everybody says, think globally but act locally. That's actually not a bad idea, but it's also important to think locally. Because if you think locally, you'll be much more effective in the way you act locally. And the sort of issues we need to ask ourselves here is, how can ecosystems be sustained? Is Kansas a functioning ecosystem? Well, you guys at Kansas State are really, in the Kanza Prairie, you have one of the single largest chunks of a still basically functioning piece of Kansas that exists. How many of you go out there? Good. I'm glad to hear that. Is that important to you? Is it a place that you really feel emotionally tied to? Because it is a big part of your local community. And then also, especially when you're looking at things that are described often as resources, how can populations upon which we depend be sustained over many generations? This is important for trees, it's important for plants, it's important for wildlife, fish, anything like that. How do you really sustain them? And in indigenous people, this has been a key area of how do they keep themselves alive because they were essentially doing a lot of hunting and gathering. And again, it's important to emphasize indigenous people were concerned with sustainability on a local basis, and their science is locally focused. So Western science tends to seek results that are global and generalizable over wide areas, but this makes things less sustainable on a local level. And one major reason for this is an important point, because this one underlies all of the stuff I've been talking about and the stuff that I'm going to talk about. Indigenous people are not immigrants. It's often said, one of the things he used to bug Vine Deloria more than anything else is that he'd be talking about indigenous people and indigenous land rights and everything, and somebody would come up to him and say, but, you know, we're all immigrants at some time, because you people came here, you know, 10,000 or 40,000 or 100,000 years ago, and my ancestors came over on the boat 3 generations ago, but that makes us both immigrants. Well, in fact, if you are an indigenous person and have evolved along with a local place, you're not an immigrant. That's what indigenous means. It means born of a local place. And so it's important to keep in mind that the cultures we're talking about evolved in concert with local environments. And then because of that, they're tied to place. And like I said, their idea of place is that it's based on relationships not only to the other people in their social community, but on to local landforms, plants, and wildlife. And then this means there's a lot of responsibility involved. One thing that's left out of many contemporary concepts of sustainability is the sense of responsibility, both for future generations and for these other entities that share the world with you. This is why I'm asking you guys how much you care about the Kansas River. I mean, in a way it sounds sort of silly, but it's actually essential, because the more responsibility that you and your fellow humans take for the Kansas River, the healthier the Kansas River will be, the healthier you will be, and it's a constant feedback. But if you treat it, oh, well, Kansas River, that's where we can dump everything we don't want. Every time there's a heavy rainstorm, all the crud that's on the streets, which is what we do in Lawrence. I'm appalled, Lawrence. I don't know what the policy is here, but in Lawrence, there really is not a stormwater runoff. Yet Lawrence, you know, and especially since we're the snobs on the knob, right? That's the term for us, because we're at the highest point in Lawrence. Every time there's a heavy rainstorm, KU sends all its crap down into the city, into the neighborhoods of Lawrence, and eventually into the Kansas River. And nobody takes responsibility for it. Certainly not KU.
Here in Manhattan, if you look at a lot of intakes, there's a little marker there that says that you're not supposed to put contaminants and stuff down there.
No filtration system.
Right. Yeah, it's the same thing. And one of the things that's important here, and this is a real key point here, because a lot of people talk about Native people being very spiritual and, you know, having mystical connections to the land and everything. Well, what happened was, in an attempt to sort of inculcate responsibility into future generations, Native people built responsibility into the rituals and ceremonies that constituted their spiritual traditions. And a big part of this was placating nature. They knew nature could change on you. And nature was often unpredictable. Here we sit in a building that got hit by a tornado. How many times has a tornado hit this building before? Never, right?
First time.
But it happened, therefore, so is it inevitable that this building or other buildings on this campus are going to be hit by tornadoes? Or is it something that happens in some places and not in others? And so when you're looking at phenomena like that, nature is very stochastic and unpredictable. The only thing we can say is that probably from November through February, there's very little chance of a tornado. Of course, with climate change, we're not sure about that. But once it starts to get to April, people on the plains start getting nervous. It's tornado season. And tornado season is our way of recognizing that nature is unpredictable and stochastic in a lot of ways. And so what indigenous people did was essentially create a lot of ceremonies that were set up to placate nature and keep nature from essentially damaging their cultural traditions and all. And the thing you have to realize here is that the size of indigenous populations and the length of time they spend interacting with a lot of places are underestimated. Here's a fun fact. More people lived in western Kansas 200 years ago than live there today. You go back 300 or 400 years, same thing's true. There were more indigenous people living in western Kansas than live in western Kansas today, because And so that means that the populations were relatively high, and because we know with our contemporary populations that there can be problems in the environment, resource shortages and unpredictable events were always possible. And since they lived in an invariable environment, you need to work and you need to exercise a great deal of discipline to minimize the chance of a shortage or a disaster happening. And so we developed rituals. And this is a key point, and this actually is one of the defining factors of indigenous life, at least it was traditionally. Respect for nature and the idea of understanding relationships with nature does not mean that lives cannot be taken. We're predators. Even being a vegetarian means you still eat living things or things that were alive. And so if you're going to eat, if you're going to be a living being, you're going to depend on other beings for your food. Now, if you are a person to whom these other beings are considered to have a real important spiritual and ecological and economic relationship with you, how can you justify taking their lives? I mean, we see all sorts of debates about ethics, in human society. Can you sacrifice 10 people to save 100? Can you sacrifice one person to save 5? But with other animals or other beings, you say, okay, can we sacrifice these other creatures that we recognize as important to allow our own lives to persist? Well, what you do is you develop rituals and ceremonies that essentially make you grateful. When you kill an animal, you apologize to it. I'm sorry I took your life. This was necessary to feed my family. Thank you very much for this sacrifice you've given. And so there was a lot of logical development and the idea of sort of establishing a permanent relationship of gratitude to the natural world. Again, how many of you guys think of thanking the Kansas River every time you turn on the spigot and water comes out? It's the same phenomenon in some ways.
Do you think that Wells Fargo thanked the sacrifice of Wachovia?
Well, that's more the economic rather than ecological situation, but.
Well, I know. I'm just curious if there is a corollary in our rituals in Western
It
culture.
depends.
We have a spirituality of the economy,
Usually what I see with the way that spirituality tends to work is that rich people who buy another rich person's thing tend to make that person very wealthy in consequence. So that's sort of a way of thanking him that we don't normally think about, so you're not taking a life there, you're just taking an entity and reshaping it for your own ends.
Well, I suppose Wachovia's board of directors might find some of themselves on the Wells Fargo board of directors.
Yeah. In fact, often the CEO will end up on the board of directors. So what happens is that when you've developed these rituals, then conservation, which is in many ways the core of sustainability, becomes personal and emotional. Essentially, people come to recognize that the natural world is providing for them and their family. This is one thing that even I have difficulty doing, although I know I need to do it more often. But when you eat and it becomes really difficult when you go down to the local Dillon's or whatever your grocery store here is in town, and you pick up a packaged piece of chicken or a packaged piece of cow or something like that and take it home and cook it. On the other hand, if you actually have to kill that chicken or that cow, then you realize the consequences of being a meat eater, and at the same time, the interaction becomes much more personal to you. So you're much more likely to show gratitude and be thankful in these types of situations. And one of the rules of this, one of the basic things that underpins indigenous spirituality is this rule that all things are connected, because by consuming the plant or animal, you essentially are proving that you and it are connected and related. You're made up of the same molecules, and you're products of the same creative process. And when I use the term creative here, I'm talking in the sense of new forms coming into being rather than anything supernatural. There's a tendency to describe creation in our society as, oh, that's something God does. No, actually, your mothers and fathers were very effective in creating you. So, all things are connected. This is based on the idea that relationships drove cultural traditions and belief systems. Also, that no living entity is independent of any other entity in the same local system. And this is a real key one in terms of sustainability, the idea that all things will survive or perish together. If you destroy something, you increase the chances of your own people or your own kind disappearing. Okay, what is this? This is the basis of the Western science of ecology. These things that I wrote up here above are all part of ecological tradition and ecological knowledge. But they're also part of indigenous spirituality. So we've got a sort of an interesting thing here in how science is done. And so you look at the relationship between connectedness and sustainability. An improper impact on the system can cause long-term problems. This relates back to the things I said earlier about costs. Remember that when we talk about economics, if you do it in terms of dollars, you tend to not realize the costs, the real costs. Whereas if you think about it in terms of connections and relationships, the costs become much more apparent. Like I said, all elements of a system are connected, so polluting or wasting can damage a system, which can result eventually in the failure of your efforts to become sustainable. These are costs that are relatively rarely factored in. And the painting I'm showing you here, this illustration, is titled Pollution Can Kill. This was a painting done by an Anishinaabe artist, Roy Thomas, and its point is to emphasize how the relationships among organisms allow toxins to spread across trophic levels, which is an economic issue, but it's also a health issue for indigenous peoples in Canada, which is where Roy comes from. So you see that as the bear, and the interesting thing he shows here is if you look at this, the body of the bear is made up of fish. And he's showing these birds here, which are usually, these are meant to be loons. And the loons and the fish are connected to each other because they live in the same system, that is the water. And as the bear draws the fish into its body, it also brings in the toxins that are in the fish. This is why, I mean, again, I harp on the Kansas River because it's local here. Has anybody here eaten a fish from the Kansas River? Would you? Would you eat a fish from the Kansas River? Why not? You guys eat, how many in here have ever eaten catfish? Okay, now I got all of you. And where did those catfish come from? River. Either river or a farm pond, which is probably dirtier in many ways than the Kansas River. Kansas River is really not that bad, but we all sort of think of it as, because we know what we do to it, and so we think of it as being contaminated, but if it shows up on our grocery store or we get it in a restaurant, oh, we don't ask where it came from and saw the environment in which it was raised, which may have actually made the Kansas River look clean by comparison. Because I've seen fish farms, and quite often they're not all that appealing. So these are things that we need to think about, because if your food's local, and the other pole of indigenous belief systems is that all things are related. This is an idea which emerges from the concept of connections and connectedness, but it's also an important realization in indigenous tradition that all life forms share a common heritage. And this is a topic that's become relatively controversial in the U.S. and especially in Kansas, because we have these debates over religion versus science. You know, are all life forms related to each other? Well, let me go back to the connected question. Could you eat a cow or a chicken or a fish or an onion or a potato if it was not made up of the same basic things that you are? including DNA, RNA, all the proteins and everything that we get, they're all made up of basically the same things. In fact, we ourselves could not live if it weren't for little bacteria that live inside our cells called mitochondria. The reason that we have multicellular organisms on the planet and didn't for the first 2/3 probably of the history of life on this planet is that some cells took other cells inside them. They originally, I guess, were planning to eat them, and then once they got inside, they said, oh, well, it's actually better to have them living inside me than to digest them. So let's work on this relationship. So every one of us, multicellular organisms, we're eukaryotes, that is, we have complex cells, but in our cells are other simple cells whose DNA is a completely different evolutionary line from ours. And plants have done a double on this because both chloroplasts and mitochondria in plants are very simple forms of life that have taken up a symbiotic life form or symbiotic way of life within other larger multicellular creatures. And so, and like I said, and one of the things that's important here is when you talk about relatedness, relatedness is seen in terms of relationships. So it also can be extended to geographical features. So you look at water, mountains, the land, any features you see around you is also being related to you, as being your relatives. And this then ties to sustainability for the same thing I talked about. Once you accept relatedness among all these life forms, caring for them as part of your community means allowing their lives to continue. And sustainability also becomes personal. And again, this does not mean that things don't change. Nature changes constantly. This is a painting by the famous Comanche artist Black Bear Boysen about a prairie fire, showing a prairie fire. And the important point that he's making in this illustration is that all of the entities here, the antelope, the wolves, and the Comanches, are all in the same situation. They're all facing the same problem here. It's going to change the environment in which they live, and they have to figure out how to cope with it. So that the key in rethinking about all this is that all systems change on an unpredictable basis, like we talked about. Look at the engineering building. And this made necessary the rituals for placating nature because you didn't want it to change too dramatically, because if it changed too dramatically, that might lower your chances or your descendants' chances of survival. And this led to the idea of trying to keep things in balance, but there's a tendency to conflate the indigenous concept of living in balance with the Western concept of a balance of nature. And the Western concept of a balance of nature assumes that ecosystems have a stable point, and if they're perturbed away from that, they'll return back to that. Indigenous people never had that concept. They knew that once a system changed, it was changed forever. You might get it back somewhat similar to what had been there before, but you'll never get it back exactly the same. Whereas Western science tends to see things the same. And so sustainability gets tied to spirituality in these traditions, because only by caring for the earth and natural systems can you truly sustain them. And this also means, and this is a real tricky one in our modern world, economic interests must not prevail over the needs of future generations. One of the most disturbing ads I see on TV now is that thing where you see, what do Americans want most? Free gasoline. Bull! I can think of, just off the top of my head, I can think of a few 100,000 things I'd prefer to free gasoline. But just the idea that what do people want is free, that would make their lives better if gasoline were free. Oh good, we could waste it even more then. In what way is that sustainable? In what way is that type of thinking meant to make things better for future generations? It's all about the comfort of people in the present. Oh, if gasoline's free, I have an extra $20 a week that I can blow at the bars on Friday night. Now, I'm being a little cynical there, but the key thing here is by caring for the earth and natural systems, then you can sustain them. And there is only one earth, which is why indigenous people tend to refer to earth as the mother. Because when you look at it really, and logically, that is the one entity that we know has been around for the existence of all life and was probably in many ways responsibility for the creation of life. So this takes us to another interesting theme here, which is metaphors, the use of metaphors and how metaphors are used to code knowledge. Now, all you guys use metaphors all the time. Metaphor is one of the key elements of language. But the thing is that indigenous concepts were often presented in a metaphoric fashion because like I said, for one thing, they were tied to spiritual traditions. And this allowed some European people to dismiss them as being mere stories or legends. But in fact, metaphors dominate scientific research and the way scientific phenomena are understood. As an example, DNA. It looks like a ladder, but it's a code. Well, it's actually not a ladder or code, but that's the way we understand it, because that makes it easier for us to grasp. Mitochondria, that I mentioned to you before, are described as being the power stations or the engines that drive our cells. Well, in fact, they're not either. They're not a power station. They actually do produce a lot of energy for us. So the metaphor is interesting, but the metaphor is not reality. And the problem is that metaphors that Western society tends to use, they think, oh, well, these are logical and rational, whereas metaphors that come from other cultural traditions, those are colorful stories. But if you look at it, ecology, and especially evolutionary ecology, which is my field, depends very heavily on theoretical models, most of which are mathematical. The irony is that mathematics is simply a short way of telling a complex story about relationships. You think about it, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, that's about as simple as it gets. What are you saying? You add 2 entities to 2 other entities, you now have more entities. This is a very mathematics is a short and elegant and sort of complex way of telling, it's sort of non-intuitive to people because you have to grasp the fact that you're telling a story that you could explain in lots of words in an equation. And it's really a story about relationships. And so what is happening is that the models that we see in science are really metaphors or analogs for the actual dynamics of populations or of other entities or interacting molecules or something, so that what we need to do is rethink our metaphor and our relationships to metaphors, because a metaphor can be a story as well as it can be an equation. The equation is just the short version of it. You show me an equation that describes any phenomena, I can tell you the story of what it does in words. In fact, that's what a good mathematics lecturer will do for you. They will say, this is what's happening, here's how we write it out on the board. Isn't this nice and short and elegant? But this is really what's going on. And one of the things we have to look at, especially in terms of metaphors, one of the most pervasive metaphors in Western science is René Descartes' metaphor of organisms, living entities being machines. And remember, humans are different. We have a soul. The soul is the ghost in the machine. That's what makes us supposedly different from all other forms of life. That was the justification to keep him from getting his head chopped off or getting burnt at the stake by the Catholic Church. Because if he just said humans are simply machines like all the other organisms, he'd seen what they did to Galileo. But the real interesting thing is that there's an implication from this that organisms are made up of traits that can be examined as individual parts. But it's impossible to tell how an organism can respond to changes in its environment simply by examining its parts. The machine model is not useful in this context because it ignores the emergent properties. And some people actually will apply the machine model to populations. Western science tends to do this, and especially wildlife. I don't want to be critical. I know you guys have the Wildlife and Fisheries program here at K-State, whereas KU doesn't. But wildlife modeling tends to mean that all individuals in a population are assumed to be interchangeable. That they tend towards an average type that can be represented by a single population-wide parameter. And then you see things like parameters that represent average reproductive output, average life expectancy, other life history traits. These are assumed to be roughly the same, or in many cases in the models, identical across an entire population. They also assume a fixed carrying capacity. That is, that the population can only hold so many organisms. If more organisms enter the system, then something has to change so that some of those organisms disappear. And I'm not going to talk about the logistic equation because we're running low on time, but the logistic equation, which is this just basically shows the carrying capacity, and it's a mathematical model that describes the growth of a population in a finite environment. But I mean, if anybody wants to go into detail, I'll be happy to go into infinite detail with it. But since we're short of time, I'm not going to bother to, because the key point that I want you guys to understand here and what I'm developing is the idea of organisms as parts. So the structure of the logistic equation and the logic of resource management assumes that individuals are average or typical. Look around the room. Who's the average individual in this room? Well, you could say that, but in fact you're not. There really is not an average individual. There's no one individual who's sort of a composite of all of us here. Maybe in age, yeah. But yeah, again, you have to look at your parameters. But what they do when they assume that all individuals are average, then a population consists of a set of interchangeable parts. All right, how does this change if we assume that individuals vary in their roles in a population? Well, there's a real interesting thing here, and this is I love this particular little story. This was in 1905, an anthropologist went and talked to this older Lakota man whose name was Okute, and he asked him to describe the relationship between living organisms. And it's interesting that the anthropologists and other people who talk about this, he's talking about this mystical spiritual relationship. Well, here's what he said. Animals and plants are taught by Wakantanka, who's the Lakota creator, who teaches the birds to make nests, yet the nests of all birds are not alike. Some make better nests than others. Some animals also take better care of their young than others. All birds, even those of the same species, are not alike, and it's the same with animals and human beings. So he's saying there is no average individual. Every individual is different. And the reason Wakantanka does not make two birds or animals or human beings exactly alike is because each is placed here to be an independent individual. Well, what Okute is doing here is in 1905, he was giving a fairly sophisticated lecture on evolutionary ecology from sort of 1995, except he used different terminology. But the concepts he was talking about were not recognized in Western science until the 1980s. So when you look at individuals vary in many ways. If you're looking at a population, they can vary in sex, they can vary in age. Look at us all in here, us old fogies, us, you young, healthy people. You can have behavioral categories. Some individuals are experienced in breeding or finding food. Some individuals are confident, others are fearful. Some are aggressive, some are timid in their personalities. There's constant individual variation. I'm going to skip that one. Actually, no, I want to make a brief point here. That there are some Western scientists who have learned to approach things the same way indigenous people was. And one of the best examples of this is Jane Goodall. Jane Goodall's work with wild chimpanzees was one of the very first attempts to look at individuals in Western science. And we all have seen what she's been able to achieve. Okay. I'm going to skip that one. All right, let's look at individual performance in real populations. In other words, how does selection act on population dynamics? Well, one of the things we have here is that in the Western tradition, actually you need to go back to that, because evolution looks at selection on individuals. Evolution looks at individuals. Population biology and ecology looks at averages. So the two are not really compatible, although they try to be. And so they're contradictory to one another. And, all right, so Western models don't really work very effectively when we're looking at individual performance in real populations. We need to look at data. What's actually going on in real populations? And in indigenous tradition, they have an idea they call, what do they call, keepers of the game. Now, it's important to realize that indigenous hunters knew the resources upon which their lives depended very, very well, and they knew most of the animal populations, and certainly the tree populations, as individuals. In fact, they knew them so well that there are lots of traditions and stories from indigenous peoples about a hunter having a dream in which, in the dream, he is shown which particular individual animal he's supposed to go out and kill. Goes out and finds that animal and kills it. If they took the wrong individual or did not treat the animal they'd taken with proper respect, the keeper of the game, who was sort of it's also sometimes described as the game boss, or sort of the boss animal or something like that, would prevent them from being able to take others of its kind in the future. Now there's a big debate. Maybe not that big, because I'm the only person on one side, and all of the anthropologists are on the other, as far as I can see. Are keepers of the game spirits, or are they metaphors for real individuals that have unusual influence on populations? Okay, to look at that, we need to know how much can an individual influence a population. Okay, there are some really interesting stories from nature, long-term wildlife studies, of real-life animals that function as keepers. There was a female wolf that lived on the island, Isle Royale in Lake Superior, and since they had every wolf in that population marked and individually studied, it occurred to people in probably about 1980 that this one female wolf, 75% of the population were her direct descendants. If she didn't exist, the wolf population on Isle Royale might have died, and after she died, the population of wolves crashed on Isle Royale. It didn't quite go extinct, but it did crash. One of my colleagues, Dale McCulloch, who's one of the best person studying deer in the world, looked at white-tailed deer, and they have what's called the George Reserve. It's a place in Michigan where they fenced in 100 acres, and they have like a 10-foot high fence around 100 acres. And every year they would go in and census and cull some of the deer. And so they would take like a couple dozen people and walk across 100 acres. Well, 100 acres would be a relatively small Kansas farm, right? And yet, so it's not that hard to explore all of it in a fairly short period. And these people would walk across it, and for a period of like 8 years, there was what they saw every individual in the population except one. There was a huge male out there somewhere that they never ever saw. They knew he existed because they found his shed antlers. But he was different than any other deer, because that's the nice thing about deer. They leave, oh yeah, Kilroy was here. Look, there's his antlers on the ground. So what you've got is, what Dale said is, this single male, who was much larger than all the other males in the population, probably was the father of almost all the deer that were born, the young deer that were born within the George Reserve, but the scientists studying this population never saw him. Okay, there are a lot of long-lived and large social organisms in the world. In African elephants, it's well known now that older experienced females are what we call matriarchs. They have knowledge about where to find water, where to find food. And one really sad, and in fact it's almost really tragic consequence, is that ivory poachers go after the big females, because they're the easiest ones to kill, because they'll stand and defend their family group against anybody. And when they kill the older females and leave, it's sort of like Lord of the Flies. You leave a population of only young individuals behind. Some of them die, and some of them even become psychotic. And this has had a really weird thing. Because one group of young male elephants, when all the old females in their group were killed by poachers, started going around and killing rhinoceroses. Hey, they're teenage boys. They're acting out. And they got nobody to tell them it's wrong. Now, I know it sounds a little sloppy, and I'm sorry to sound a little non-scientific here, but in fact, when you're dealing with organisms like this is a key way to think about these things. There we go. Okay, in marine mammals, sperm whales and killer whales, old females are known to be the core of the social group, and the scientists who study them have described them. These are the keepers of the cultural traditions. So let's close here by looking at some real population dynamics. There have been 12 long-term studies of bird populations that have been studied for multiple years. In all these populations, they found that 60 to 85%, depending on the species, 60 to 85% of fledglings died before they could breed. Typically, and this is the real interesting thing, about 5% of all fledglings produced more than 50% of the offspring in the next generation. Of birds that survive to breed, it's typical for 15 to 20% of these individuals to produce significantly more. And a study that I did myself, this is on western gulls, Larus occidentalis, that I studied for 13 years on Alcatraz Island, and I obtained lifetime breeding success for 120 pairs. This is the lifetime reproductive success of these birds. And what you see is, this is the number of offspring fledged down here on this axis. This is the number of pairs. And the mode, the largest category here, is 0. A lot of failures, even among breeding adults. But out here, you have 4 pairs that manage to produce more than 25 chicks over a 13-year period. There are 802 chicks produced totally over the period of our study. 240 of these chicks were produced by these 10 pairs. So that keepers of the game are, or at least an analogy, there are organisms in almost all natural populations that have been studied that have undue impact or excessive, very major impact on the survival and even the existence of the next generation. So if we're going to try to make populations sustainable, we need to figure out how to protect key individuals. But the Western management tradition has a name for such individuals: trophy animals.
But what's to say another animal won't step up into that role?
Because when we looked at the birds on Alcatraz, nobody filled their places. I mean, you know, if they died, it wasn't like they held a super good territory or anything. It was just that there was something about their combination of experience and being in physiologically good condition and healthy. I mean, it's largely a matter of luck. It's not actually good genes in many cases. It's largely a matter of luck as to which individuals actually end up doing this. But they do exist. These few, like that female on Isle Royal. I mean, when she died, nobody took her place. And what's interesting is it was a female, not the male. Everybody talks about, you know, the alpha male of a pack. Alpha males come and go. It's the alpha female who makes things happen.
Do we have a very good understanding of the role of intelligence in this whole process?
I suspect it's very important, but we really have... Again, intelligence is one of those things that we sort of know exists, but we can't really understand what it means. We're not even sure what it means in humans, so trying to describe what it means in other species really gets complicated. Well, I'm finished, so thank you all for your attention. And I'll be happy to take questions, even though I know that probably some of you need to take off.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have a question. Go ahead.
No. Unless you guys need to take off, I'm willing to stay and answer questions.
Okay. Well, so I was talking about sustainability in this discussion group or whatever, and I was saying that we should mimic, you know, the ideas of the Native Americans, you know, because I did studies about it last semester. But then this person was saying that actually the Native Americans were known for taking an area and actually polluting it, and they would pollute it until they had to leave and go to a new area. And I'd never heard that before, and I was wondering if you, basically, you know, with their urine or, you know.
Well, I mean, basically all living creatures do that.
Right.
I mean, and if you, any organism, I mean, if anybody's ever been on a seabird island or a sea lion colony or something, I mean, you know, the same thing happens. Yeah, I mean, you know, you get concentrations of waste products around. And one of the real ironies of this is one of the few things that the Renaissance actually was developed to do was sanitation. Because people freaked out in Europe after the Black Death. Understandably. I mean, you know, 25% of your population dies. It tends to have an impact on you. So in consequence, they started figuring out, you know, that prior to, you know, what during the period we called the Dark Ages, there were a lot of Europeans who lived and thought the way Native Americans did. And with one major difference, they tended to have domestic animals that they actually had live in their houses, and they lived on very close terms with them, so that there were lots of diseases, because virtually every disease that's a problem in humans started in some other species, usually one of our domestic commensals, and then jumped the species barrier into us. But when the plague came in, it sort of changed the way people looked at the world, and they started figuring, well, a lot of our ideas right now are superstition and praying to our God, and you know, doing the rituals didn't seem to work against the plague. And ironically, the same thing happened in North America. When Europeans came over and brought their diseases, one of the things that a lot of Native Americans flat out panicked when disease would hit their communities, because all the rituals and all the ceremonies they developed to keep things like this from happening weren't working. And in Europe, basically, some people sat down and said, there needs to be some differences. And this is where the origins of Western science were doing it, things like, where did disease organisms... Nobody, remember, people didn't have a germ theory until Pasteur in the 19th century, but they knew that there was some sort of link between filth and disease. And so they started developing sewer systems and trying to get sanitation going. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure native communities soiled the local area, but they moved frequently enough. And I mean, you know, it's like rotating cows through a series of pastures. They'll graze it down, and they'll leave a lot of material behind. But if you keep rotating them, it never has any real serious negative impact.
Fertilizer.
Yeah, in fact, it can be fertilizer. So, I mean, there's all sorts of stories about, you know, oh, my God, Native Americans were actually living organisms. They weren't mystical beings. Well, yeah, I'm pretty ready to accept that. And the same thing's true of any group of organisms.
Yeah, another side of this, I've heard historical studies of Native Americans who consciously betrayed their own culture in working with Western immigrants in exterminating the buffalo and engaging in capitalism and trade and all that sort of thing, as a kind of cynical look at Native American culture.
Oh, you mean Shepherd Craig? Shepherd Craig's Ecological Indian? That book?
I'm not.
Oh, okay.
I don't know specifics actually, but at any rate, though, no, this sense of desperation, though, is a partial explanation.
Oh, yeah. I mean, remember that all the accounts we have of most tribes and their ecology and behavior came from Europeans who encountered them after their lives had already been severely impacted by disease and other factors.